Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I have great hopes for today's debate, and in that spirit, may I start by congratulating colleagues on the Conservative benches for their candour in the amendment they made. Not everyone is prepared to acknowledge failures in negotiation shared between the UK Government and perhaps the Scottish Government. But I think if we acknowledge where we're not succeeding, then we've got hope of going forward. Because indeed, fishermen in Scotland have expressed their disappointment about the blue whiting catch allocation. 7 percentage points given away today, just as control over our waters was in 1983 at the end of the 10-year derogation. And that leads me to say we might usefully look at a little bit of the history that got us to where we are today. And the reason for doing that is so that we don't repeat some of that history. The original commitment to surrender our fishing rights out to 200 miles came in 1971. It was effectively entrenched into law when Ted Heath signed the Treaty of Accession on the 22nd of January 1972. And this is the important point, that only after that was the actual treaty published and subject to democratic scrutiny. The most objectionable part of the treaty was that fishing decisions could be made by a majority, sometimes a qualified majority. And the issue of opening up the result of negotiations before we get committed to them so that parliamentarians can look at them is perhaps one in another context we'll return to at a later point. Now, the fishing negotiations we're talking about today, of course, are ones so unsatisfactory that even landlocked countries in the EU can essentially block our interests. Now, the SNP have recognised all this from the very outset, and that is why we have opposed the common fisheries policy in all its forms from the beginning. And hopefully, we're going to get to a position of a reasonable consensus in this chamber. Now, my very first speech here in June 2001, well, up the road strictly, the words that I quoted then from this Parliament's European Committee, I think are equally relevant today, that we should try and get everyone to speak with one voice. There are tensions that should be buried for the common good. That was advice from the Parliament's European Committee in 2001. It's still good advice today, and I hope that we're able to do that. It's worth saying that my colleague Donald Stewart, who was the leader of the SNP in 1982 in the Westminster debate that preceded the formation of the common fisheries policy in the current form, said on the record then of fishermen, they have been betrayed, the result was a catastrophe. And I think that we see that that is a view that was shared. Austin Mitchell, another great champion of fishing communities, it was a Labour motion, by the way, that was being debated, I should perhaps have said. It also spoke up in similar terms, as indeed did some, but not a majority of Conservatives. And certainly when the vote came at 7 o'clock at night, the Conservatives voted down a motion which would have been a proper sense of where we were at that point. Now, the thing we've got to grab hold of as well is, of course, that fisheries negotiations are not just a matter for those who catch fish. They're also a matter for our processors. In my constituency, processing is a major source of employment, many thousands of people, and people in that industry wait equally anxiously for the outcome of each year's negotiation. It's no small matter for Peterhead and Fraserburgh, where the contribution from landings was over £150 million last year. That's nearly £4,000 per head of population, a very substantial matter indeed. But it equally matters to constituents in the south of Scotland, in Eyemouth, and of course Mr Scott's constituents in the furthest north. Now, in 1997, my political colleague, Dr Alan McCartney, MEP, published a considered proposal for the reform of the CFP. And there's a couple of things in it that throw some light on how we got to where we are that we might take notice on. One of the things that the linguist that Alan McCartney was highlighted was in the Spanish Act of Succession of 1985, which essentially eliminated the ability for the UK to veto results. In part, that arose between a difference between the Spanish version of the treaty, the language was different, and the English language of the treaty. The Spanish language missed out the word solely, and it was the one that was used when the decisions were made. I see Travis Scott nodding, so he's familiar with this. So sometimes it's very simple little things that can get us into real difficulties in the long term. So he went on, and I think it's interesting to say this 1997 paper that Alan McCartney produced might form a useful basis for the policy we might adopt now. Others may take a different view. But one of the things he wrote about was what was needed: a new framework whereby coastal states with the greatest historical interests in specific fisheries would be able to take key control and management decisions relating to the fisheries in the waters of their coasts. Now, of course, he was seeking to get change within the common fisheries policy. It's quite clear the dynamic in politics and practical affairs today is somewhat different, and there may be a particular opportunity that will come. Now, I know others are going to speak about choke species. That's going to continue to be something that's a matter of importance to our communities. But one thing, too, that is an issue in the current arrangements is not enough of the fish caught in our sector is landed for the benefit of our communities and the processors in our communities. Now, it's not irrational for fishermen to go and get the highest price they can, be that in Norway or elsewhere, but I think we have to bear in mind that our quotas were given out at no cost, and if we've got new quota because of new opportunities, we have to look at a new way of doing things. Ultimately, Presiding Officer, fish is a delicious, healthy way of eating. There is a vast network of fish and chip shops across these islands for giving us all access to fish. That's what I most enjoy about fishing. But this debate is a key opportunity for us to join together. I hope at 5 o'clock we can all agree a common position to the benefit of fishing communities, fishermen and Scotland and the UK as a whole.